Hi there. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 34. So, two things before we get into the questions. First, I just want to make a quick correction from last episode, which is that the name of the third Nobel Prize winner was actually David Baker. I incorrectly referenced epidemiologist David Barker, who pretty much started the field of fetal origins of adult disease. But did not, in fact, get the Nobel Prize in chemistry last week. That was David Baker. And secondly, your book, Determined, celebrates its 1 year release anniversary today. And not to embarrass you, but it's a pretty darn good book. So, viewers, if you haven't read it yet, make sure you go get your copy. All right, sales pitch over. Okay, so we're going to start with two questions related to some of the unfortunate directions that empathy can go. So, Anthony from Los Angeles says, do you think too much empathy can be a bad thing? Does it open you up to getting scammed or feeling too much psychic pain? And Jonah from Arizona says, I often briefly perceive symptoms in myself when my child is sick or even when I'm in the medicine aisle for a child. I don't experience fear of catching the illness. It seems to work by mere suggestion. It can happen with other people who present symptoms around me too, though less strongly. Do illness empaths exist? And is there a known spectrum of this ability in the general population?
Well, empathy, if we make a distinction that's made in the field between feeling empathy and acting compassionately, more in the context evolutionarily, let's make a distinction between feeling empathy and acting in an altruistic manner. And people have been arguing about altruism and the evolution of forever. This whole notion, is there really any such thing as a purely altruistic act? Driven perhaps by empathy. And of course, the snide responses when you look at animal social behavior, altruism is deeply, deeply embedded in reciprocity, reciprocal altruism. You are being altruistic to another individual, another brine shrimp, whatever species you are, with an expectation of something coming back instead. And reciprocity jumpstarts cooperation of that sort, and a gigantic literature looking at that and looking at what are the circumstances that are most likely to foster altruism. So certainly a case like that, you're being altruistic because of an expectation, then it's going to be reciprocated. That ain't pure altruism. Then, of course, there's the realm of sort of human questionable altruism, this strange world that we've managed to enter, where we have things like feeling good about yourself, having a perception of what kind of person you are. I couldn't go to sleep at night if I were not to do something like that in that circumstance. So internalization of that as a whole, like unlikely blow to the notion of there is such a thing as pure altruism. Then, of course, there's studies showing when you see someone conspicuously being altruistic, game theory models showing everyone trusts them more. Everyone is more likely to make assumptions about their benevolence and prosociality. And what you're left with there is that's not pure altruism either. And what you're left with, I think, is sort of this key issue of anonymity. 12th century philosopher Maimonides said the best type of charity is when the person giving it does not know the recipient and the recipient does not know who's giving it. Anonymity stripping away a lot of this stuff. And you see the limits of that with, your friend comes in one day and says, wow, this morning I saw on my block there was all this litter and I cleaned it all up. And you know what? There was absolutely no one around, no one to see me doing that. Are you going to tell me there's no such thing as altruism? That was totally altruistic. To which the other person says, yeah, until you told me about it. So anonymity is a big feature of it. So, insofar as we have altruism being driven by empathy, there's a whole realm of empathy as bad news when it's just idiotic and misplaced and triggers altruistic behaviors that don't actually make things better. Oh, I don't know, you've read that there's all these refugees in the Darfur region in Sudan, and they're fleeing their homes with just the shirt on their backs and all of that. So moved to act altruistically, you send them a whole bunch of tuxedos and ball gowns and such. Okay, so that could be a misplaced version. Then there's versions of altruism where you're not actually doing the person any favors. Oh my God, I love you to bits and I can't see you going through the pain of withdrawing from heroin. So here's some heroin, the codependency of that. Then, of course, there's altruism that could take the form of damaging everybody else. At least for me, the example that immediately comes to mind is anti-vaxxers, people who don't vaccinate their kids. They're old-time anti-vaxxers before these were conspiracists with like space lasers trying to take over the Federal Reserve, but instead just the old, ooh, there's occasionally side effects to vaccines. I love my child like crazy, so I'm not going to vaccinate them. Okay, what's the issue there? What's the pathology of that being placed on everybody else? I'm not going to vaccinate them, and I'm going to depend instead on everyone else having their kids carry the risk burden and generate herd immunity by vaccinating them so that my kid, in the game theory jargon, could be a free rider in those cases. So there's all sorts of circumstances where you can act altruistically in ways that like are really not a great idea. Also, in terms of empathy, altruism, what you see is all sorts of developmental aspects, and two come to mind. First one is kids having to develop, in effect, ego boundaries between them and their mother. You were too young to remember this because you were not conceived yet, but the time mommy hurt her thumb or whatever, and your older brother Benjamin spent the whole day wandering around the house saying how his thumb hurt. There was not a whole lot of a boundary between mommy and me, and thus her pain was my pain. And developmentally, one begins to put a totally different realm of developing sort of parameters around your empathy is training of doctors or nurses or dentists or whatever, where you got to accept that as part of doing good, you're going to have to hurt some people. And that toughening up process is like brutal for med students, their first year on wards and such, of recognizing that's not a place for empathy. You have to harden. So then there becomes this whole issue brought up. And the question is there such a thing as too much empathy? Pathological empathy, as it's termed in some places, or hyper empathic individuals. And looking at that literature, there's no actual like definition of it, but it's just that people were really, 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 really empathic. And as a first pass, that could be translated into people who really, really, really feel other people's pain. Now, neurobiologically, this is very interesting. I think we've talked about sort of how much the brain falls for metaphor. Ooh, someone severs your arm, that's painful. Ooh, you see somebody else looking lonely and you feel their pain. That's just a metaphor. But remarkably, this part of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, there are neurons in there that cannot tell the difference between your pain and their pain, between your physical pain and your psychic pain. I mean, there's subparts of it in terms of what you do. Very cool paper recently in Nature showing that, you got a mouse and there's another mouse there that this mouse likes, and the first mouse is miserable. And what you see is the second mouse, if they like them and they know each other, will groom this first mouse more. Ooh, this empathic action there. But then the very specific case where the mouse is in pain because you've made a small incision or something. And what you see there is the empathic other mouse will now groom this individual more, but specifically licking at the injury site. And what this paper showed was both were dependent on this anterior cingulate, but different circuitry involved in each. But nonetheless, this is a part of the brain where somebody else's pain, as far as those neurons are concerned, feels as painful to you as if it's your own. And of course, the problem becomes pain is painful. And if you're pathologically subject to empathic pain, that becomes really painful. One worry is you burn out, depression, all of that, helplessness because of how much people's pains you can't do a damn thing about. The other is empathic pain is painful. Look the other way, run away from it, decide it's not your problem. And there's a whole literature by now. There was a wonderful piece by Yale psychologist Paul Bloom a couple of years ago entitled Against Empathy, which got a lot of comments. And he made the point that there's this problem that empathy, and we're training kids to be empathic, and we're training our guppies to be, and it's so in vogue and all of that, that empathy is worth squat if it doesn't actually turn into an action, an act of compassion, an altruistic act, whatever. And he was saying the dangers of empathy being so damn trendy is the temptation to decide that merely feeling empathic is a virtue in and of itself. That's enough. Ooh, you feel bad for them, and that's the beginning and the end of it. And what that's tightly intertwined with is when you see when empathic pain is painful, there's a fairly decent likelihood that someone is going to say, I can't take this, and I'm going to decide it's not my problem. So, turns out to be really interesting literature on you look at somebody who was feeling empathic pain. What are the predictors of whether they're going to turn away or run away versus they will actually act compassionately? And there's two very different types of predictors, which, when you think about it, nonetheless turn into the exact same thing. First one is physiological. Look at somebody, they're watching somebody else in pain, and it's gruesome and it's disturbing and all of that. And you see how much does their sympathetic nervous system activate? How much does their heart begin to race? How much does their stomach clutch? How visceral is their response? And the more of that response you have, the more likely you are to decide this empathic pain I'm feeling is way too painful. I'm out of here. If your visceral response is one of just being overwhelmed like it. On a cognitive level, the other predictor intertwines with that very readily, which is you look at somebody else in pain. Do you think, oh my God, that is so awful? It would be terrible if I were experiencing this, versus, oh my God, that's so awful. It must be so terrible for them experiencing it. When your response is, oh, it'd be so terrible if I were experiencing it, that for one thing is probably synonymous with your heart is racing, and that's the other predictor of get me out of here. So, of course, the worries with sort of the dangers of empathy is one, if it prompts you to do nothing and it's a virtue in and of itself, and if it instead takes the form of you just needing to get out of there. Now, all of this brings up the individuals who are truly, truly atypically empathic and hyper empaths or things, and there's no clear definition of them, but just people who are way, way off the charts in terms of that. And what are they like, and what are our reactions to them like? And there was a fascinating article in the New Yorker some years ago talking about a strange, strange population of humans, people who donate organs to strangers, people who read online about someone saying, if I don't get a kidney, I'm going to die, all of that. And they're number 4,000 on the waiting list. And something about them tugs at your heart, and something in you responds to the notion of, I want to make this gesture. And before you know it, you've done your due diligence to make sure this isn't a scam, but people who volunteer to donate organs to strangers. And this was this New Yorker piece that had this great title, The Kindest Cut. And it described this really interesting phenomenon in that these people creep everybody out. The doctors and the nurses get rattled and unnerved by them. This is not coming in to donate to your best friend, your coworker, your loved one, your relative, but just total stranger volunteering to do this. And they're all like unsettled by this person. For one thing, they're suspicious of them. They can't believe the person isn't somehow expecting to get paid under the table, or some sort of acclaim, or this is going to get them a green card or score brownie points with their parole officer. Or often what's the case is, ooh, you think they're emotionally now just going to inveigle their way into the life of the person they donated the organ to. Are they now going to have a surrogate mother, a surrogate? Have they bought themselves familial connectedness, all of that? So there's a tremendous amount of suspicion of people like this. And there's also a tremendous amount of anger that they provoke. Somebody winds up, the local newspaper says, oh, this person did this wonderful thing. They donated it to the stranger, and they get inundated by savagely angry, broken emails from people saying, how dare you? My loved one is dying of this right now. And why did you go and allow somebody to jump the list ahead of them? Newspaper op-ed pieces condemning these people for how dare they play God. And that being part of the assumed motivation for them, they get to decide if this person will live or die and how bad all of that is. And it's got this terrible reputation. And ultimately, when you look at what it's about, is this interesting contrast that we have. Okay, we don't like violent people, we don't like killers. And in our minds, there's a clean distinction between, like, in the midst of a rage or whatever, you do something violent and murderous. And that kind of is very familiar. That's very human. That's very primate. And then there's that major pejorative of pathological violence when you're looking at someone who's a cold-blooded killer. And that just doesn't feel right. That feels reptilian, sort of thing. What we have here is the rattledness we feel when we see someone having their body cut into, having all of that going on in a way that feels cold-blooded empathy, cold-blooded altruism, and that feels very unsettling. There's one other downside to sort of hyper empathic people, and why people get pissed off at them when they've gone and donated an organ to a stranger, whatever, is, whoa, they're going to make us look bad. And okay, so that seems kind of a stretch, but some years ago there was a wonderful paper in Science looking at game theory, when you cooperate, when you cheat, when you punish someone for making an unfair offer. And what they did was a cross-cultural study. They looked at people in 40 different countries and seen what's the propensity towards cooperating, how much do you forgive, all of that. And the researchers, this is a group that does wonderful work in this area in, I believe, Germany or Austria, discovered something totally wild and bizarre and unprecedented, which was there's a subset of countries where you see people who punish people for being too generous. Whoa. And this was called like pathological punishment. You punish someone for being too nice in their gameplay with somebody else. What sort of countries? And you look at them and they were uniformly like the most miserable of the ex-Eastern Bloc countries, the ones who have the lowest level of social capital and the highest level of distrust of each other. And what was this? Damn it, don't go and be generous. You're going to raise the expectation that anybody else is supposed to give a damn about any of their neighbors. And so you see that as another version of, yeah, you're just going to make us look bad. So you have all these ways in which, not only can excessive empathy and altruism be ridiculous and misguided or damaging or so unprecedented that everybody like wonders what's up with you. Of course, there's an old Freudian paper looking at people who are hyper empaths, which is what, and of course, they trashed them in all sorts of ways. Obviously, they were masochists. Obviously, they were forming reaction formation to being victims of childhood sadism. Obviously, they had unresolved homosexual urges. Who knows what the hell that was about? Penis envy, pregnancy envy, all that. So everybody sort of trashes with that we are accustomed to care typically coming with some sort of parameters of reciprocity or some sort of parameters of how the person gets a self-image that make it easier for them to go to sleep each night, kind of thing. It's an odd domain where we react to people who are hyper altruistic. And as summarized in one quote in this article, what you wind up seeing is when you look at the organ donor and the person who received it, the organ donor winds up loving them more than the recipient loves them back. something about the cold-bloodedness even there. Now, this brings up a really interesting, strange phenomenon, sort of one of these bizarre outposts of empathy, this phenomenon called couvade. Couvade was originally an anthropological term describing rituals found in a whole bunch of traditional cultures. And there's records that this was the case in ancient Egypt. New Guinea Highlanders carry out couvade ceremonies. What are couvade rituals? Some guy's wife is pregnant, and what he does is he replicates, he confabulates having symptoms of pregnancy. Among the New Guinea ones, you build your own hut, and the man goes in there, and while she's in labor, he's shouting out about how much pain he's in. And what's this is about some ritual of I am taking on your pain or reaffirming your family connectedness or whatever. So that's couvade as an anthropological term. But then there's couvade syndrome, which is a medical term of men who take on some of the medical features, the medical symptoms of pregnancy when their beloved is going through pregnancy. Now, this is not something that is generally seen, which is all sorts of like men during their partner's pregnancy have an increased likelihood of medical checkups or elective surgery. You decide this is a great time to get my like cartilage in my knee fixed so I can pace around uselessly while she's going through labor, or now's the time for the nose job. So my kid will decide I'm good looking or something. No, this is individuals who come in, and these are men who put on weight and are nauseous and bloom with unlikely acne. And they eventually go through labor pains. Or the thing that I thought was most charming was one of the symptoms of Couvade syndrome is excessive earwax, which I had no idea that's something that happens to you during pregnancy, but that's what happens to these individuals. And just to sort of follow with our theme, the Freudians had something snotty to say about Couvade syndrome as well, which is these are men who are obviously pathologically dominated by their wives and partners going through this. So we just see all sorts of pathology there. But yeah, another version of empathy that one might not expect. So, in answer to the second question, we feel the pain of our loved ones. And if it could take the form of you sprout with empathic acne when your beloved is going through pregnancy, and she is, so you do also, you certainly can feel the pain of your child being ill. And there is nothing pathological about that in principle. That's a fairly normal thing, whether you're a mouse grooming someone in pain or a mother looking at their child of the primate type. And this is quite familiar. One final point here about this, lest you take a path of neurobiology that is very tempting, but sends you into purgatory, an anterior cingulate feeling empathy when you see somebody else's problem. There are these neurons called mirror neurons, which activate when you are replicating an action that somebody else is doing. And these were discovered decades ago. They're totally cool. They have to do with observational learning. And from day one, every single review on the subject in the next to last paragraph saying, ooh, and mirror neurons may be the neurobiological basis of empathy. And for 30 years, those reviews have been saying that. And all things considered, there's absolutely no evidence that what's going on in this anterior cingulate area is mirror neurons. So in case you're a mirror neuron fan, that's just to throw some cold water on your enthusiasm.
What we aim to do on these videos here. So now Demir from Kazakhstan says, is there a biological mechanism to regulate birth ratios of males to females in a population? Maybe external factors affect that ratio?
Great question. And this has been a hot topic among a field, I don't know if anyone calls it much anymore, sociobiology, but sex ratios. And what are the circumstances where it fluctuates? Okay, so in principle, it's a 50-50 sex ratio in all sorts of species, but you get variation. And what you get is a phenomenon of regression to the mean. Suppose just by chance, there winds up being way of an excess of females. Who becomes valuable then? You want to give birth to a male. because there's a shortage of males. So you get selection going in that direction. And soon, if you have an excess of males, who becomes more valuable to give birth to? Give birth to a daughter because they're rarer at this. And so you have oscillation around the mean. And you see this in populations. Okay, leaving out the obvious, how do you go about deciding I'm going to have a male rather than a female? This is just the evolutionary models at this point, and the fact that you see this with population fluctuation. So then, famous paper by this genius, eccentric pioneer in the field, Robert Trivers, and a colleague, Dan Willard, a computer scientist, of looking at the evolution of sex ratios and the evolution of means of regulating it. And what you had this all built around was a really important thing, which is on the average, males have more variability as to how many copies of their genes they leave in future generations than females do. What do I mean by this? If you look at like a strictly pair bonding species like gibbons, pretty much whatever number of kids the female has, the same number the male's going to have. But if you look at species instead that are not monogamous, what you see is, okay, females can have 0 to whatever number of kids, males can have 0 to whatever, and males can potentially have a far higher maximal number of offspring than females do. You look at females, and what's the range? Worst case, 0, but that's fairly rare. Most female and species out there will reproduce, but you have a couple of kids or maybe 5 kids, but you don't have 400 of them. But then you get males who, in polygamous species, are highly successful and they have vast numbers of kids. Example of this, elephant seals. A guy named Bernie LeBoeuf, UC Santa Cruz, did research back when showing 95% of matings are attributable to 5% of male elephant seals, which tells you, like, okay, you're a female elephant seal, and occasionally the outcome is you don't have an offspring. If you're a male elephant seal, there's a 95% chance you're never going to have an offspring, and a few of them have hundreds of kids instead. Males have more variation in reproductive success than females do in all but the most monogamous of species. So you look at that, and let's phrase this a slightly different way. Having a male is more of a gamble than having a female. Because what's the range with females? Likely there will be reproduction, and the maximum number is not all that different from 0. With males, likely that there's not going to be if you're an elephant seal, but if you're really a gambler, go for it. So, under what circumstances does it make sense for everybody to start skewing towards having more females if there's a drought, if there's some ecological pressure going on because times are bad and a female is a more prudent investment? And people in this business actually use the word investment under those circumstances. If you have a female, your offspring, who is malnourished at points during development and all of that, and she grows up, depending on the species, it's still likely that she will have an offspring. If you have a male, like unless he's had the greatest luck of any male, like the odds are overwhelming already, he's not going to reproduce if it's an extreme polygamous species. So when times are bad, females are, quote, a safer investment. So if all you're doing is making predictions based on evolutionary thinking like this, you would say, oh, during periods of drought, during periods of famine, things of that sort, habitat degradation, et cetera, you should see skews in populations towards an excess of female births relative to male births. And this has absolutely been seen. Now, superimpose something on top of that. And Trivers and Willard went after this as well, which is, okay, so this is saying if you're feeling lucky, go for a male. And if times are bad, that's not a lucky time. So you get the skewing there. If you were feeling lucky, what sort of social organism might feel lucky if they're high ranking? If you're high ranking, your kid is going to get all sorts of advantages, starting off with how many calories you're feeding them when they're a fetus kind of thing. That generates a second level of prediction. When you look at species, for example, with sort of strong dominance hierarchy stuff, you would predict that high-ranking females are more likely to give birth to males than females. Low-ranking females go for the much safer investment. And there's some evidence for that. It's complicated. In some species, if you're a high-ranking female, you really want to have a daughter because she inherits your high rank from you. So it depends on the species. But overall, what we see is, wow, the more of this kind there is, the more you want to have that kind. So oscillating. And if times are bad, you really don't want to choose to have a male offspring. Go for a female. But if you're high ranking, that's probably a cue that you should be more willing to gamble all that. So that's great. Those are just so stories. Just so stories often sort of supported by actual data when you look at sex ratios in natural populations. But this brings us back to the question, how does this work? What is like you decide you're going to have a male, you decide like you're a brine shrimp, just to bring them up for a second time as our poster child of unlikely species. You're a brine shrimp and you've decided that this is a time to have more of a bias towards this sex rather than. How does that work? Who decides? Nobody decides anything. Here's what it's about. In mammals, males, male fetuses are more expensive than female fetuses. They tend to be bigger. They have a higher metabolic rate. You've got to invest more calories in them. So what you begin to see is for the same degree of, for example, food shortage, because a male is taking more calories than a female fetus does, you're more likely to miscarry with the male. And as a result, you are now having a tilt towards an excess of female births during a period of famine. If you're a high-ranking female, you have great nutrition, and thus your more expensive male fetuses are more likely to survive. So you've got to tilt in that direction. And coming back to the notion and the question of external fertilization, there's species, turtles, tortoises, whatever they are, where they have temperature dependent sex determination, and that's a function of rank. Can you crawl your way up the beach and lay your eggs in a nice shaded spot versus if you're low ranking, you're stuck out in the sun, and thus the eggs develop in different temperatures, and sex determination is done with that. And I've never understood how that works. But in mammals, at least, it's simply this rule that male fetuses are more expensive. When times are good, they're more likely to survive. When times are bad, they're more likely than female fetuses to not survive. Okay, so you look at that and you would say, whoa, given ups and downs and low ranks and all of that, that should predict already at birth there should be an excess of females because already you were disproportionately losing male fetuses to miscarriage and stuff when things get bad and illness and nutritional problems, all of that. Whoa, but there's basically, you don't see that. There's not an excess of females at birth. And what do you see in humans? Simply because males get trimmed at a higher rate than females, starting with fetal life, and at every point in lifehood, you've got to have a skew right off the bat towards having more males because there's going to be more of an attrition of them along the way. And what do you see with humans? You look at sperm that carry an X chromosome versus a Y. The Y is going to give rise to a son, the X to a daughter. There's roughly 110 Y sperm for every 100 X sperm in humans. Then you look at the likelihood of a fertilization being successful. And there's roughly 108 males for every 100 females. Then you look at by like third trimester, you're around 105 to 100. At birth, there's a skew in favor of males. It's about 104 to 100. Why is that? Because pediatric diseases, infant mortality, all of that is more likely to do in males. And you don't see typically in a Western population a 1-to-1 sex ratio until late adolescence, early adulthood. That's when the advantage of we've got to have 10% more male sperm because they're so vulnerable and they're getting winnowed down all the way, that it's not until late adolescence that the numbers finally come down to about equal. And then you go and you look at the other end of life and look at geriatric populations. And by then, you've got this preferential winnowing of males like crazy at that point. Typically, in Western populations, when you look at 80-year-olds, there's roughly 60 to 80 men for every 100 women. That your payoff is like, because at virtually every point in life, males are more vulnerable for a variety of reasons, some of which have to do with like the idiocies of what testosterone does to your body and your behavior. So, great theoretical models as to how you would want to have a boy or a girl under this or that circumstance. And it turns out some very straightforward physiological mechanisms by which that's brought about. So, totally cool subject.
And of course, anyone who has spent time around teenage boys knows just how much food they do indeed require. And that's all for episode 34. So keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Share Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.